The night wind moved through the tall grass like a long, slow breath, and the moon hung low over the quiet village as shadows stretched across the red earth, and the sound of distant drums traveled through the forest as if the ancestors were awake. And watching her name was Amara, and she was running through the narrow path between the sacred trees with her heart beating hard inside her chest and sweat falling from her face as she pushed her tired legs forward. The village healer hut was far behind her now, and the only light came from the burning torches that shook in her hands as she ran. Because her husband, Cato, had come to collapse suddenly during the evening fire ceremony, and the elders had shouted that he must be taken to the spirit healing house near the river, where only special nurses trained by forest spirits were allowed to enter. Mara could still hear the wild cry that left Cato's mouth when he fell. His body had shaken as if a storm lived inside him, and his eyes had rolled back, showing the white like dead river stones, and the old women had started chanting fast words that spoke to trees and stones and unseen hands. The air had smelled like burning herbs and fear and old magic, and now she was running toward the sacred healing place that sat alone beside the dark river, surrounded by tall, twisted trees that bent like old men guarding secrets. Too heavy for the living, the night grew colder as she got closer, and the wind carried strange whispers that did not sound like human voices, and the river made a low, deep sound like a giant animal breathing in its sleep. The spirit healing house came into view, built from black wood and long bones of sacred animals, with a roof made of woven grass that shined like silver under the moonlight, and in front of it burned a single fire that did not move even when the wind passed, showing it was not a normal fire, but a spirit flame that stayed calm because it belonged to another world. Amara reached the wooden door and pushed it open, and warm air touched her face, thick with the scent of crushed leaves, drying blood, and old smoke inside. The house was dark, but small fire bowls hung from the ceiling, giving the room a red glow that made the walls look like they were breathing, and several shadowed figures moved slowly around a carved wooden bed at the center of the room, where her husband lay still, his body wrapped in white cloth with strange signs drawn over his skin with black ashy, stepped forward quietly because fear had filled her bones. When she saw the strange scene, and then a soft voice came from the darkness behind her saying, "Hide, it's a trap," and before she could turn, her body froze as if invisible hands had grabbed her legs. The voice was not loud, but it was clear and full of warning, and it sounded like a nurse, because only the nurses trained by spirits were allowed inside this sacred place. Her eyes widened and her breath stopped as she slowly turned her head and saw a woman standing near the wall, dressed in long dark cloth with her hair tied high in the style of river healers, and the woman's face was half covered by shadows, but her eyes shone bright like water under moonlight, and she lifted one finger to her lips in silence and slowly pointed to a space behind a tall wooden medicine shelf. Amara's heart pounded louder than the drums from the forest, but she trusted the warning without understanding and moved slowly toward the dark space behind the shelf, her hands shaking as she pressed herself against the cold wall and pulled a curtain of hanging dried herbs around her body, hiding her shape from anyone who might enter from her hiding place. She could see through the hanging leaves and smoke as the door of the spirit healing house opened again, and heavy footsteps came inside, and voices followed, low and rough. This was not how true healers moved. This was not how nurses of the spirit spoke. They walked rough like hunters, and their voices were full of hunger, not care. 3 men entered, wearing animal skins and bone necklaces that marked them as members of the forbidden cult, known only in village whispers as the Shadow Harvesters, a group that believed the strongest men should not die naturally, but should be offered to dark forest spirits in exchange for power, and the ancestors hated them because they stole souls before their time. Men walked toward the bed where Cato lay, and one of them laughed low as he placed a hand over Cato's chest and spoke words that made the fire bowls flicker and the shadows climb higher on the walls as if something unseen had lifted them. And the nurse who had warned Amara remained still, her eyes watching everything. Without moving her body, Amara's stomach tightened. Because she could not scream, she could not move. She could only watch as one of the men pulled back the white cloth from Cato's face and held a curved knife made from black stone that seemed to drink the light around it. The room felt heavy like a storm cloud pressed against the ceiling, and even the spirit fire began to tremble then. Something even more terrifying happened. Cato's eyes opened slowly, and they did not look confused or weak. They looked awake, like he was not surprised to see the man, like he had been waiting. And when he spoke, his voice was calm and deep, saying, "You came later than expected." And the men stopped moving for a second because they saw his eyes shining with a strange power. Amara's mind began to break because she did not understand what she was seeing. Her husband, who was supposed to be dying, was talking like a man who had planned everything, and the nurse slowly shifted her body, her face tightening in fear as if even she had not known this part of the secret. And the forest wind howled outside, pushing against the walls of the healing house as the drums in the distance grew louder, like a warning from the ancestors. Cato slowly moved his hands under the white cloth and pulled free as if invisible ropes had been cut, and the black signs on his skin began to glow faintly like dying stars. And he turned his head toward the dark corner where Amara was hiding, and for a brief moment his eyes met hers through the hanging herbs, and he whispered her name. Not loud, but clear, as if he had known all along exactly where she was standing. Her shattered inside her chest, and her hands covered her mouth because a sob tried to escape her throat. And now she knew that the trap was not only for him, it was also for her. And the nurse, who had whispered to hide, tightened her fists, looking from the men to Cato and back again, as if she had just realized she was standing inside the belly of a living nightmare. And as the spirit fire suddenly went out, leaving the room in near complete darkness, and the river outside roared like an angry beast, the shadows walked closer to the bed, and Cato slowly sat up, smiling, a smile that did not belong to the man she married. The real danger had just begun. The darkness inside the spirit healing house became thick like wet cloth, covering every corner, and the only sound was the slow breathing of the men and the river roaring outside like an angry spirit trapped in a cave. Amara stayed frozen behind the hanging herbs as fear crawled through her bones, and her hands shook against her mouth while her eyes stayed locked on Cato, who now sat upright on the wooden bed like a man reborn from shadow. Nurse, who had warned her, stepped slowly to the side, her feet soft on the earth floor, her eyes never leaving Cato, and the three men of the shadow harvesters moved closer, their bone necklaces rattling softly like tiny bones, speaking to each other in fear because they could feel something had changed in the air, and this change did not belong to them. Cato raised his hand slowly, and the strange black signs on his skin began to glow stronger. Like small fires burning under his flesh, the air around him became cold and heavy, and the fire bowls that once hung quietly now started to shake as if an unseen wind had entered the room, and the wooden walls creaked like old trees bending in a storm. One of the men tried to speak, but his voice broke, and the curved black stone knife in his hand began to tremble. And Cato looked at him calmly and said their plans were weak because they listened only to broken spirits hiding in dark roots, while he had listened to something older, something buried under rivers and mountains and bones of forgotten kings. The men glanced at each other in confusion and fear because they had never heard of such a spirit, and their knowledge was built on forbidden songs whispered by dead leaves, and they did not like hearing that there was something deeper than their darkness. From her hiding place, Amara felt the floor grow colder, and she could smell the sharp scent of iron and wet soil, as if a grave had opened under the house. And the drums in the forest began to beat faster, louder, like a war song rising from the earth, and she felt like the whole world was leaning toward this small room, waiting to see who would control what was being born inside it. The nurse moved closer to the wall where carved spirit marks were drawn, and she touched one with her fingers and whispered a prayer that spoke to light and water and wind. And as she did this, the shadows pulled back slightly, but not fully, and Amara understood that this nurse was not part of the trap she was trying to fight. Something that was bigger than all of them. Cato turned his head slowly away from the men and looked up toward the ceiling where woven grass hung like a sleeping sky, and he spoke again. saying that the ancestors had chosen him because he was born under a red moon beside a tree that had swallowed lightning, and that his blood was not simple. Like other men, his blood was old and carried the memory of angry gods who were locked under the earth long. A Gotha shadow harvester leader stepped forward, trying to control his shaking body, and raised the knife and said that no man could escape their ritual, that his body belonged to the dark spirits, and that his soul was already tied by ancient ropes. But Cato only smiled wider and lifted his hand, and the knife flew out of the man's grip and smashed into the wooden wall as if pushed by invisible hands. The fear in the room grew stronger, and the spirit fire suddenly burst back to life by itself, burning high and tall without smoke, and in that light Amara saw that Cato's eyes were no longer fully human. They carried a faint golden glow like lion eyes shining in tall grass at night, and she felt both love and terror twist tightly inside her chest. The nurse suddenly turned her head toward Amara's hiding place and whispered her name, not aloud, but through the moving air, and Amara felt the sound inside her mind like a bird beating its wings, and she understood that the nurse wanted her to listen carefully and remember everything, because none of this was happening by chance. The men began to back away slowly, but the floor beneath them began to crack like dry earth, and thin black lines spread like crawling snakes, and from those cracks cold dark smoke started to rise, wrapping around their legs and pulling them back toward the bed. And now their fear turned into real panic, because they felt hands that were not human touching their skin. Cato stood up fully, and his feet touched the ground without a sound, and every step he took made the wall carvings glow brighter and brighter, and he walked slowly toward the leader of the men and placed his hand gently on his chest, and the man went still, his eyes wide as his body stopped fighting and became weak like wet cloth. Cato leaned close to his face and spoke in a voice that did not sound like his own voice, saying that tonight was not for sacrifice. It was for awakening, and that the shadow harvesters were only small insects compared to what was coming through him. And he pushed the man backward, and the man fell to the ground, breathing hard like a child lost in the dark outside. The wind changed direction, and the trees began to sway as if bowing to something unseen, and the river roared louder, and the drums in the forest turned into a fast, wild rhythm that sounded like the footsteps of ancient warriors running across the land. And Amara felt her heart beat in time with those drums, as if the earth itself had entered her chest. The nurse moved quickly, now drawing a circle in white ash round herself and whispering words that made the hanging herbs shake and glow faintly. And she looked at Cato and asked what he had done to himself, and why the house of healing now felt like a house of waking nightmares. And Cato paused for a moment, as if remembering something painful, and for a brief second his golden glow faded, and his eyes looked almost human. Again he said that he had gone into the forbidden forest alone many nights ago and spoken to a spirit that lived under the roots of the oldest tree, and that spirit had promised him strength, protection, and a future where no one could ever harm his family if he allowed it to sleep inside his blood until the right night came. And this was the night it had woken up. When Amara heard this, her body felt like it was breaking from the inside, because she realized that her husband had carried this secret silently while she cooked food and sang songs, believing they lived a simple life. And now that simple life had cracked open like dry wood in fire, and the truth was darker, deeper, and more dangerous than she ever imagined. The shadow men finally turned and ran toward the door, but the door slammed shut by itself, and the spirit fire bent low as if bowing to Cato. And the last thing Amara saw before the house filled with thick black mist was Cato lifting his face toward the sky and whispering that now the real game with the ancestors and the buried gods was about to begin. The black mist filled the spirit healing house and swallowed the walls, the roof, and the hanging herbs, until everything became heavy and blind and wet like the inside of a closed mouth. And Amara stayed pressed against the cold wall, unable to move, as the air touched her skin like cold fingers, and the drums outside grew louder and faster, like a heart beating under the ground. When the mist slowly thinned, the house was no longer the same. The walls looked older, the carvings looked deeper, and the fire bowls burned with a blue light instead of red, and the three shadow men were gone, as if the earth had opened and swallowed them, and the nurse stood in the white. Ash circled, breathing slowly with sweat shining on her face like river water. Under moonlight, Cato stood alone in the center of the room, but he did not stand like a man anymore. He looked like a bridge between two worlds. His shadow on the wall moved differently from his body and behind him. Amara thought she saw other shadows that did not belong to anyone in the room, tall, twisted shadows shaped like trees with faces and wings made of smoke. The nurse slowly stepped out of her circle and called Amara by name softly, and Amara felt her legs finally obey, and she stepped out from behind the hanging herbs, her whole body shaking, but her eyes fixed on her husband, and when she stood fully in the open, Cato turned to face her, and for a moment there was silence so thick that even the river sound felt far away. He looked at her, and his face softened like clay touched by warm hands, and the golden glow in his eyes faded, and he whispered that he did not want her to see him like this, and that he had tried to protect her from the truth, but now the old spirit inside him had decided it was time for her to know everything. The nurse walked between them slowly and spoke of ancient stories, told only to chosen healers, stories of men who walked into deep forests and came back with pieces of sleeping gods inside their blood, and how those men were never fully human again, but became walking doors through which old powers could return to the world. Amara listened and felt her heart stretch in pain and fear and love as the house creaked and the blue fire moved gently like waves of the river, and Cato confessed that the spirit inside him was called the Root King, a forgotten force buried under the oldest tree where the land first rose from water, and that this spirit hated the shadow harvesters because they only worshipped weak, broken darkness, while the Root King wanted the world to remember the true old ways of power and respect. As he spoke, the walls began to show moving pictures like dreams painted by smoke, and Amara saw visions of ancient villages built from gold, earth, and bone. She saw queens speaking to lions and hunters walking beside spirits shaped like fire and water, and she saw a massive tree rising from the center of the world with roots wrapping around sleeping giants deep underground. The nurse rushed forward and touched the floor when she saw these visions, because she understood the danger, and she cried that such power should not walk freely among humans, and that the ancestors had buried those gods to protect the living from their hunger. And Cato looked away for a moment as if those words hurt him. The blue fire suddenly lowered, and the room grew cold again, and a deep voice whispered through the walls, though no mouth could be seen, and the voice sounded like many voices layered together, like wind moving through 1,000 dry leaves, and it called Cato by another name, a name older than the hills and the rivers, and Amara felt her ears ring as she heard it. The nurse fell to her knees and began to chant fast while drawing fresh ash signs on the floor, and the voice grew louder, saying that the time of sleep was over, and that the blood door had opened, and that the land would remember fear and fire and power. And Cato bent forward as if the voice was pulling him from inside. Amara ran forward without thinking and grabbed his arm, and when her fingers touched his skin, she felt burning and cold at the same time, and her mind filled with images of roots breaking through stone and ancient faces screaming from under earth and water. And yet within all that darkness she felt something familiar, something that still felt like the man she had loved. She shouted his name silently in her heart, because her mouth could not move, and the voice through the walls paused for a moment as if surprised by her touch, and then laughed in a way that made the wooden beams shake and the blue fire flicker wildly. The nurse shouted that the Root King was trying to fully awaken through Cato, and that if this happened, he would no longer be a man. He would become a walking shadow god, and the world around their villages would be twisted by old forgotten laws. And Amara felt tears run down her face without sound as she realized she could lose him forever. Suddenly the ground outside began to shake, and the sound of many feet running filled the night air like a storm of hooves, and the nurse listened closely and whispered that the elders were coming because they had felt the tremor of forbidden Power and the circle of fire in their bones had started to burn. The walls of the house began to crack, and thin beams of moonlight entered, slicing through the blue fire and shadows, and Keto pulled his arm gently from Amara's hand and looked at her one last time with eyes that now burned brighter than before, and he said that the elders would never let him live if they knew what he had become, and that she must decide in her heart whether she feared him or believed in him. Just as the heavy footsteps of the approaching elders reached the door of the spirit healing house, the Root King's voice returned louder than ever and promised that blood would answer blood and power would answer fear, and the future of the land was about to change forever. The heavy wooden door of the spirit healing house began to shake under the force of the approaching elders, and their staffs hit the earth outside in a slow, deep rhythm that sounded like thunder waking from sleep, and the air inside the house became tight and hot, as if the walls themselves were afraid of what was about to enter, and Amara stood frozen between the nurse and Kato while the blue fire twisted high above them. Kato's body started to tremble again, not with weakness, but with the strain of holding something too large for a human frame, and the shadow of the Root King behind him grew longer and darker, stretching across the carved walls like a living tree of night, and the nurse quickly drew another circle of ash around Amara. Whispering protection words that tasted like bitter roots and cold spring water, the door burst open with a loud crack, and the elders stepped inside carrying carved staffs tipped with feathers, bones, and shining stones, and their faces were painted with red, white, and black symbols that marked them as guardians of balance between the living world and the spirit world. And behind them came warriors with spears, their eyes wide with fear and duty, the room filled with the smell of sweat, smoke, blood, and old leaves, as the elders stepped forward and saw the glowing signs on Kato's skin and the unnatural light in his eyes. And they immediately raised their staffs and began to chant words that pushed against the air like strong, invisible waves, and the blue fire lowered again, as if pressed down by their will. Amara felt the power of the elders like a storm crashing around her, and she almost fell to her knees, but the nurse held her steady and whispered that she must stay strong because her heart was connected to Kato's heart, and that connection was the only thing stopping the Root King from taking full control. One of the eldest stepped closer to Kato and declared that the old buried spirits were never meant to return, and that any man who carried them must be sealed or destroyed to protect the land. And when Amara heard the word destroyed, her chest tightened and her breath came in silent, broken waves. Kato lifted his head slowly, and the shadow behind him rose up like a tall tree of smoke, and he spoke back to the elders, saying that the world was changing and that the forgotten powers were not evil, but angry because they had been buried and silenced, and that he was chosen not by darkness, but by balance. And he begged them to listen rather than fear. The elders raised their staffs higher, and the warriors circled the room, tightening their grip on their spears, and one of the elders hurled a small white powder into the air, and it burst like a cloud of light, and when it touched Kato's skin, he cried out in pain as the glowing marks burned brighter and spread across his chest and arms. Like fast-growing roots, Amara could not stand still anymore, and she ran forward, stepping out of the ash circle, and placed herself between the elders and her husband in her arms spread wide without thinking, and the nurse shouted her name, but it was too late because the power of the chanting struck the air around her, making her hair and clothes fly like they were caught in strong wind. The room went quiet for a brief, heavy moment as the elders stared at her, and she felt their eyes like sharp stones on her skin, and she spoke with a trembling voice that carried strong truth. She said that Kato was still her husband, still a man of heart, and that if they chose to destroy him, they would also destroy the light of love that still lived inside him. Oldest elder stepped forward and looked into Amara's eyes, and he saw fear, but also fire, and he asked her if she was willing to carry the curse with him if the buried god inside him broke free and swallowed their lands in shadow, and she hesitated only a breath and then nodded because her heart already made the choice before her mind did. The chanting slowly stopped, and the warriors lowered their spears but did not leave their ready stance, and the shadow behind Kato shrank slightly, though it did not disappear fully. and the Root King's voice withdrew into a low, distant rumble like thunder. Rolling far away beyond Mountain Skato, walked slowly toward Amara and fell to his knees before her, not in weakness, but in sorrow and gratitude. And he touched her hands to his forehead and whispered that he had tried to protect her by keeping his secret, but now she stood in the middle of it and there was no turning back. Blue fire slowly changed back to a soft red glow, and the carved walls stopped moving, and the air in the room eased. But the danger did not leave it, only slept lightly, like a snake in warm grass, and the elders warned that this peace was temporary and that the spirit inside Cato would not rest until it was either fully awakened or fully sealed forever. Outside, the forest wind howled again and the river roared, like it was angry at being watched, and the drums began to beat faster and faster as if announcing to the unseen world that a new path had just opened, and the nurse looked at Amara and Cato and said that what they faced next would be far greater than the shadow harvesters or the anger of the elders. The night sky above the spirit healing house turned darker than before as heavy clouds rolled over the moon and swallowed its light, leaving only faint silver lines breaking through like thin cracked bones, and the forest around the house began to bend and whisper as if every tree had a mouth and every root had an ear, and deep inside the earth something old and hungry started to move. Cato stood in the center of the room with Amara by his side, and the nurse and the elders formed a wide circle around them, but even with all this strength, the air felt unsafe, like walking on dry leaves above deep water, and the drums outside did not stop. Instead, they grew louder, faster, and more chaotic, as if ancient armies were marching closer through the forest. The eldest elder suddenly stiffened and placed his staff on the ground, and his eyes widened because he could feel a shift in the spirit lines under the earth. And he shouted that the shadow harvesters were not gone. They had not fled. They had only gone underground to prepare a greater ritual that would tear open the boundary between buried gods and the living world. The ground beneath their feet began to shake, and cracks appeared in the earth floor of the house, and from those cracks poured dark smoke that smelled like old blood and rotting leaves, and from the darkness came low chanting that did not belong to any human throat, and every wall inside the house started to bleed thin black lines as if the wood itself was afraid. Cato's body arched backward as the signs on his skin burned bright like fire, and the shadow of the Root King burst out behind him, rising to the ceiling like a massive tree made of smoke and screaming faces, and this time, the Root King's voice was not a whisper, it was a roaring storm that filled every corner, calling the shadow harvesters weak and calling for true awakening. Amara held Cato tightly and felt his body heating and freezing at the same time, and she heard his heart beating in a strange double rhythm, like two hearts fighting for the same space, and without thinking, she pressed her forehead against his chest and whispered old love songs that her mother taught her, songs that spoke of calm rivers and warm fires and peaceful mornings outside. The ground split open with a loud tearing sound, and from the earth rose dark pillars covered in twisted symbols, and the shadow harvesters appeared again, emerging from holes like insects from a broken nest, their eyes wild and their mouths filled with black foam, and they began their final ritual, chanting words that pulled the wind backward and made the trees bow low. The elders raised their staffs and called upon the ancestors, and bright white light burst from the stones and feathers and bones tied to their staffs, and the warriors struck the earth with their spears, calling the names of old kings and queens and legendary hunters who once walked the land with spirits as brothers and friends. And the sky above cracked with silent lightning that lit the forest like burning milk. Cato screamed, not in pain but in battle, as the Root King inside him fought to rise fully, and the shadow harvesters tried to control that rise, and his shadow grew and shrank and twisted wildly like a storm trapped in human form, and the nurse rushed forward, pouring sacred water over his glowing skin and shouting that only a heart stronger than a god could decide this. Fatimara realized in that moment that this was the true climax of their lives, and that the forest, the river, the ancestors, and even the buried gods were watching through wind, leaves, and shadows. And she stood taller and lifted her head, and spoke loudly for the first time, naming the Root King. Not as a master, but as a guest inside the body of the man she loved her. Words shook the air, and the chanting of the shadow harvesters broke for a second, and the huge shadow behind Cato paused, as if confused by the strength of a human voice that was not full of fear, and the elders felt this change and struck their staffs harder into the earth, sending waves of light through the ground. The pillars of darkness outside began to crack, and the shadow harvesters panicked as their controls slipped. And they cried out that the Root King belonged to them, but the deep voice from inside, Kato, answered that it belonged to no one, and that hunger would not be chained by fools. The earth opened wider, and a massive root made of stone and light broke through the ground, wrapping around the dark pillars and crushing them slowly, while the forest screamed in the sound of wind and breaking wood, and the sky turned a deep red as if the land itself was bleeding. Cato fell to his knees, screaming, as his body could no longer carry the full force of the struggling powers, and Amara dropped with him, holding his face in her hands, and she looked into his eyes and begged him to choose her. To choose the village, to choose the living world instead of becoming a walking god of shadow and roots. For a long, terrible moment, everything stopped: the drums, the chanting, the wind, the trembling earth. And inside that silence, the Root King and Cato's true heart battled without sound, a battle older than words and stronger than stone. And finally, Cato's eyes shifted, and the golden fire slowly dimmed. The massive shadow behind him began to shrink, folding back into his body like smoke pulled into a closed fist, and the roots of light outside slowly withdrew into the earth, and the dark pillars collapsed into ash, and the shadow harvesters scattered screaming into the forest as the balance of power slipped from their hands. And the silence that followed was heavy, and the land felt wounded, but alive. And Cato lay in Amara's arms, breathing slowly like a man returning from a very long war. And everyone knew the final battle on this land had just ended, but the last cost still waited to be revealed. The morning light rose slowly over the land and touched the tops of the trees with soft gold, and the clouds faded into pale shapes as the wind moved gently through broken branches and tired leaves, and the spirit healing house stood silent and cracked like an old warrior resting after one last battle, and the earth stopped shaking, as if it too was finally breathing again. Cato lay on the floor wrapped in clean white cloth, while Amara sat beside him with her hands resting gently over his heart, and the nurse and the elders stood around them, not as fighters now, but as watchers of a fragile peace, and the warriors had lowered their spears and planted them in the soft ground outside as a sign that no more blood would be asked from. This night Cato slowly opened his eyes, and this time there was no golden fire in them. Only deep, tired brown like rich wet soil after rain. And when he looked at Amara, he did not see fear or distance. He saw the face that had held him in the middle of darkness and called him back from a world that did not belong to the living. And he tried to speak, but only weak breath came from his lips. Eldest elder stepped forward and placed a hand on Cato's head and said that the buried spirit had not fully died, but it had been placed back into sleep and sealed deeper than before, and that this seal was not made by magic or a staff or a chant, but by the strength of a human heart that chose love over power and fear. The nurse moved to Amara and told her that not every battle is won by spears or rituals, and that sometimes the strongest shield in a world filled with gods and monsters is the courage to stand in front of danger without hatred and without desire for control. And Amara listened silently, because her heart already understood this truth from the silence of the night outside. The village slowly woke from sleep, and people stepped carefully from their homes, feeling the air, carrying strange memories they could not fully name. The river flowed calmer, the trees stood still, and the drums that had beaten through the night were finally quiet, and even the birds sang softly, as if respecting the new peace that had been carved into the land. Cato was helped to stand, and though his body felt weak, his spirit felt lighter, because the heavy voice of the Root King no longer pressed against his thoughts, and he walked slowly out of the spirit healing house holding Amara's hand, and for the first time since that terrible Night he felt the warmth of the sun without the cold touch of another world inside his blood. Elders gathered the people and spoke of what must never be forgotten. They said that power taken in secret grows wild and dangerous, and that any spirit or strength gained without balance would one day turn against the heart that carried it, and they reminded everyone that the ancestors buried certain forces not because they hated them, but because they loved the living enough to protect them. Amara and Cato returned to their small hut near the edge of the forest, and their life did not return to normal, because some nights the wind still whispered strange sounds, and some dreams still carried visions of roots and shadows and ancient faces. But they learned how to live with those memories without letting them rule their hearts, Cato taught the young hunters that courage is not found in making deals with darkness, and Amara taught the young women that love is not weakness, and that a strong heart can bend the will of storms if it stands firm in truth. And slowly the village began to feel stronger, not through fear but through wisdom that grew quietly like deep roots under calm earth. The shadow harvesters were never seen again, because they understood that true ancient power could not be stolen or forced, and the buried gods remained asleep, not because they were chained, but because they were respected and left alone, and the land found its balance again between living breath and silent spiritas. The seasons passed. The story of that night became a legend told by elders near warm fires. And they would say that a woman once stood between fear and love and chose love, and that choice saved a man, a village, and the peace of the land, and children listened with wide eyes while the wind moved through the grass and the drums beat softly in the distance. And the final truth of that story was carried by the ancestors into every heart that listened, which was that true power is not in darkness or buried spirits, but in the courage to protect life, choose love, and walk in balance. Because any strength gained without wisdom will destroy the soul, and any love held with bravery can silence even the loudest darkness.